People are asking you to talk more about the gas and liquid versions of the center column and to talk more about that center column.
Okay. This is, I started to sort of go off onto this particular tangent earlier, and then didn't quite get a chance to complete that. But so one of the things that occurred to me when this story came to me in 1988, 1989, and I began trying to ascertain the authenticity of not only the claim, but the validity of the technology that was claimed to be a part of the system, was to look around and see whether or not there was any cross-pollination, any kind of evidence outside of the basic story from the eyewitness that this kind of technology was seen or had been seen inside the stereotypical alien flying saucer, you know, from the alien abductees and this kind of thing. I had occasion to make an appearance on a radio program out of Las Vegas. It's a precursor of Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM. It was called The Happening, with a fellow by the name of Billy Goodman. This was circa 1989, 1990, kind of being broadcast out of Las Vegas. And Billy Goodman had a tremendous fascination with UFOs and the whole genre of alien abductions, this kind of thing. And so he had a number of witnesses, individuals on the program, who claimed that they had been victims of the so-called alien abduction phenomenon. And I thought, well, okay, if that's true, then there might be a chance, however slim, that these people who had experienced this had an opportunity to see or to be shown components that were part of the propulsion system. And so I contacted Billy Goodman through the radio station. I asked him if he had ever interviewed any of these individuals who'd claimed that they had been involved in the so-called alien abduction phenomenon. And I could just imagine people in the audience rolling their eyes and saying, oh, okay, now it's getting too far out. But anyway, so he said, yes, there were several young ladies that he had interviewed over a course of time who had claimed and, had everything from missing pregnancies to scoop marks and this kind of thing, that suggested that there was some authenticity to their claims. So he gave me the names. We got the permission first from these individuals, gave me the names of a couple of the young ladies, and I contacted these people and interviewed them face to face on a one-on-one basis, and was stunned, absolutely stunned by the things that I saw and heard. And principally because two of these individuals had implants that you could see, you could either see the implant behind the eardrum. Most people don't realize that the eardrum is a very thin diaphragm of tissue, and it's semi-transparent. You can actually, with a good otoscope, this little thing that the ear, nose, and throat doctor uses to look in your ears and see what the health of your inner ear is, you can actually shine a light in there, and you can actually look through the eardrum and see part of the cochlea, the part of the ear that discriminates what frequencies of sound you hear. But this young lady had an otoscope that she'd gone out and bought in order to show her friends, yes, for real, I've got an implant in my ear behind my eardrum. And sure as heck, she did. I had took the otoscope and I looked in fact, I looked at the other ear that did not have this implant to see what the normal sort of control eardrum looked like. And then she showed me the one on the side with the implant, and you could see this device. It looked like kind of a fat metallic horseshoe, basically sitting right over the top of the tympanic bones that go between the eardrum and the cochlea. It just gave me chills to see this. And what was really weird was that this young lady, within a year or so after her abduction, had also experienced the so-called military abduction, where a bunch of guys in, like Green Berets showed up in the middle of the night, kick in her back door. I saw the back door with the big characteristic sawtooth chuck-a-boot tread pattern on the door where they kicked in the door, hauled her out, used an aerosol to knock her out instantly. Subsequently found out from another friend of mine in the special ops community that the aerosol is referred in the community to the angel of death in a can. It's a chemical called tryptomethyl chloride. It dramatically increases the amount of serotonin and melatonin produced in the brain. The minute you smell it, knocks you out, puts you to sleep, basically. And if they give you enough of an inhalation of this stuff, it'll stop your heart. It'll put you to sleep for good. But they sprayed this stuff in her face, knocked her out, hauled her out on a stretcher. Her neighbors, who were terrified, saw the whole thing because of the commotion, the noise that it made when these people showed up, hauled her off. She was put into a helicopter that was sitting on a helicopter pad right at the base of Mount Wilson, just in Pasadena. And I've been there, I've seen the place where she was taken to. She was taken there on a Humvee on the stretcher from her house around this valley that she lived on the edge of to the helipad, put on the helicopter. The helicopter took off, flew over Mount Wilson, and was going into the high desert. When she regained consciousness, began to wake up, they sprayed her again a second time. Next thing she knows, she wakes up in an underground facility. She's in a room, checkerboard, black and white, square pattern, tiles on the floor, no windows. And she overheard a lieutenant colonel. She recognized his rank insignia and his uniform, Air Force rank, lieutenant colonel, talking to some medical techs about how they were going to get this implant out of her ear without actually killing her or permanently disabling her ability to hear anything. And they were convinced that they couldn't take this thing out without harming her. So at this point, the military people leave the room, and these little gray, stereotypical gray aliens come in with the big eyes, the big heads, and all this kind of stuff. And she said, I made a discovery that night. She says, they made me so angry that I would not look at them. And she said, I discovered that the whole vehicle to their control over human beings is through the eyes. There's something in the optics of the eyes. If you don't look into their eyes, they can't control you. She wouldn't look at them. And so she said, these entities were running around the room, bumping into the wall. It looked like little toy robots that were all sort of running around, bumping into each other, bumping into the walls. They were terrified because they couldn't control her because she would not make eye contact with them. And at that point, a much larger, about a 9-foot tall entity, looked like a praying mantis with black obsidian hard rock exterior, came in wearing kind of, like the sort of a hooded robe, walked in and basically forced her telepathically to submit. And she says, the next thing I remember, I woke up in my bed. Well, all of these things sound highly suspicious and very strange, but I looked in the ear and I saw the implants. I met another young lady who had had similar experiences, and she described her abduction sequence and being put on a table, having her head locked into a harness, kind of a saddle that came up behind the neck on either side of the head, with her head turned back, and a kind of a plate that came in, grabbed her lower jaw, held it down, and a device trundles up to the table. This thing looks like a giant mechanical arm, extends out with what look like two giant syringes side by side. And she said the extension, the needles, if you will, that came out of these syringes were about a 3/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch in diameter. And there was like a little BB type device on the end of each one of these extensions. And these things were driven right through the roof of her mouth and into the lower brain case with no anesthetic at all. She passed out in the process from the pain. And so after I'd interviewed her, I said, well, okay, interesting story. Have you ever had an X-ray where these things could be seen. And she said she had. And I said, well, were there any scars that were left over from this process? And she said, yes, there were. And I said, well, I've got a flashlight out of my car. Let's go out and have a look. And so up to that point, I was, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. She opens up her mouth and I shine my flashlight in there. And I saw right at the tail end of the hard palate of the roof, right in front of the uvula, there's a little thing that hangs down in the back of your mouth, looks like a little stalactite. Just in front of that are two penetration scars, look like two small 22 caliber bullet holes in the roof of her mouth. And I mean, I got chills when I saw this. But she also described seeing a propulsion system. And this propulsion system involved a central column with a small diameter spinning device at the base of it. It was sitting down in a circular kind of a well below the floor level. There was a railing around this pit that this central column was mounted in the center of. She said that in the central column was what looked like a liquid mercury with small flecks of darker material, like little flakes of pepper that were sort of circulating. But because of the way this material was, whatever the material was, this liquid was in the column, she said that she could see turbulence patterns in the liquid because the column was constructed of a clear glass-like substance. She could see the liquid moving around inside this column. And what she saw looked like a series of tornadoes that followed a helical pattern that basically ascended and spiraled, went around the circumference of the column as it was ascending. And those vortices themselves were spinning, and there were 5 or 6 of them around the circumference of the whole cylinder as this process was ongoing. Now, if you know anything about hydrodynamics and fluids and the things that go on in fluids, you know that if you have that kind of a circulation pattern, you basically have two surfaces that are moving past one another in opposite directions, basically like taking a pen or a pencil and rolling it between your fingers. That kind of a process is going on. That would create that kind of a circular pattern or circulation pattern in the liquid that was inside the column. But if there are two different columns and the liquid is ascending as it's being twisted on the way up, that means that it's also coming back down. It's a closed loop. So that means that the system that they're using in the more advanced version of this propulsion system involves a mercury liquid that has two concentric cylinders, one inside the other, spinning in opposite directions. And that the liquid is being introduced into the top of the system during the electrical discharge event. And as that loop of that loop of charged ions is shooting down through the inside of that inner cylinder, it's performing the same function, perhaps in a more efficient way than the one that uses the gaseous version of mercury. Anyway, so that's one little story.
Okay, let me jump back in. Let me go to Wayne now, and I should apologize for stepping out for just a sec. And let me see. There we go.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's great to be here and to see you all. So I just wanted to address the question that David had earlier about the, because I think I know where he's coming from with the theory. I'm pretty familiar with the theory of Alzofon, Fred Alzofon, and the dynamic nuclear orientation. And so what I think, I have a couple of ideas that might apply to the pulsing of the capacitor plates and those high intensity electric fields going across those dielectric materials, and the interaction of the bismuth atoms with those fields. So I've had this idea for a while, and there's two possibilities I think might make a connection. So in a capacitor, when the dielectric is polarized, as we know, the orbital electrons are pulled to one side of the nucleus. So that makes an asymmetric magnetic field. So those unpaired electrons that are pulled to one side, their magnetic moment might influence the magnetic moment of the nucleus, causing it also to orient itself or reorient itself in one direction. So you have, in a sense, you have a type of dynamic nuclear orientation with the pulsing, the electrical pulsing of the dielectric material. And I think that might have an effect with the atoms that have the unpaired nuclear spins in the dielectric. The other possibility is there is something called, which is like, it's a type of NMR. It's called NQR, and that stands for nuclear quadrupole resonance. So it's a type of spectroscopy they use, or that's known about, where instead of using radio waves and magnetic fields to orient or process nuclei or nuclear particles, it's called zero field NMR. So there's no magnetic field, but instead what it uses is in the nucleus, certain nuclei have an unequal distribution of charge. So when you apply an electric field, it creates a moment on the electric field which would cause it to reorient itself in alignment with that electric field. Just looking on some of the charts, I mean, not every atom has this property. I believe it's generally the nucleus with an odd number of nucleons in it, or an odd number of protons. But so it is possible to use oscillating electric fields to cause the nucleus to vibrate or orient itself repeatedly. So I think that might, it's just two ideas there. I think that might be a unifying principle that brings what your father's theory is, and also what might be observed in this craft as well. So I just want to leave that with you guys, and any input that you have there would be great to hear. Thanks.
Thanks, Wayne. I don't know if Ron caught that. I don't see him on the screen.
Oh, was he asking about Ron Kita's?
Well, I think he was making reference to what David had talked about in his father's research about subatomic particles and the things that happen to the electrons when they are subjected to certain type of dynamic charging forces and so forth. Did I get that right, Wayne? I don't hear him.
Yeah. So I would encourage you guys to just read up on what David has written about the theory. Basically, if you're familiar with dynamic nuclear polarization, which is a well-known technique, which is like NMR on steroids, creates a hyperpolarized state in a material. So what they use is a magnetic field that they apply externally to a sample, and that causes you can target the nucleus directly, or you can, in the case of DNP or DNO, which the Alzofons are talking about, you put the external magnetic field across the material, which causes the electrons to precess around that field, and they precess is what's called the Larmor frequency. And so at that Larmor frequency, that's like a resonant frequency, right? So if you then excite the material usually with microwaves, if you're doing dynamic nuclear orientation or dynamic nuclear polarization, you'd be probably working with the microwave band, right? So that, because of the coupling between the unpaired electrons and the nucleus, so they transfer their angular momentum to the nucleus. So when they get excited, they tip over, and then that causes the nucleus also to tip over, and then they sort of, they precess very violently. And so in the spectroscopy, they use that, then they turn the field off. Once they turn the field off, then the nuclear particles relax. That's called the relaxation time. And as they're relaxing, they're then giving off this same frequency of radio wave energy. So that's then detected. So that's kind of that whole science and that process. So in NMR, they don't target the electrons, they target the nucleus directly. And they do kind of the same thing with applying radio waves to excite the nucleus into precession.
And then that gives a signal back. Yeah, me and Wayne are both working on the same system of dynamic nuclear orientation. And something that David Alzofon mentioned earlier was that his dad told him there's another way to do it without microwave energy, just by spinning the sample in the homogeneous area or the laminar area of a magnetic field. That's exactly what you have over here. In the core of the ARV is a spinning aluminum flywheel. And the reason why you're using aluminum is because it has a high strength memory effect for its nucleus. The nucleus maintains the orientation the best of all the elements. But just by spinning it inside the laminar section of a magnetic field, you're able to create dynamic nuclear orientation, which then permeates the rest of the vessel. And I think what's going on in the plate is sort of the Podkleonov effect, the impulse capacitor that he built. So that's what I think is going on in the base. So this is a source of thrust. This is a source of dynamic nuclear orientation. And this is the control rod to control which ones we're turning on. And somebody asked me once why I thought it hopped. And I said, probably because they couldn't complete the dynamic nuclear orientation enough because it was close to the Earth. And dynamic nuclear orientation, it's basically it's a state of matter. Think of this, the second law of thermodynamics states that everything becomes entropy, everything becomes messed up. So, you drop an egg, it becomes, a mess, and you can't make the chicken hatch again. So the same thing happens at the core of an atom as well. The subatomic particles, their spins are intrinsically, all completely random. And that is one of the fundamental facts of nature. And it probably, most likely connects with Earth's gravitic field, because Earth's gravitic field comes from the nucleus. So it should also be in this random state of entropy. So what we're trying to do over here is create dynamic nuclear orientation, or basically creating coherent matter. Just like coherent light is a laser, incoherent light is, everything else. We're trying to create coherent matter, which removes yourself from the inertial frame. Now, to create that to that point is pretty difficult, and it doesn't work up to 100%. So you still need a thrusting vector to move around.
Now, would you consider that a polarization process, Mark?
Yeah, you're polarizing the you're polarizing the atoms in the molecules of the craft. It's polarization of the craft.
Is Tim still online here?
Yeah, I'm still here, and actually, I just turned off Ron's video because it looks like, yeah.
I couldn't tell whether he was there or not.
No,
can I ask a favor, Tim?
Sure.
Is it possible to get a bathroom break?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well.
So what? Yeah. Why don't we take 5 minutes, and what I'll do is mute everyone, and then we'll come back. It's 1:56 now. So, do you guys want to come back at 2?
How about don't mute everyone? Just leave the conversation open.
Okay. So
right.
I guess we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes then, and I'll put it on gallery view.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, I guess it's open, and I'll just ask all to unmute right now, and
everyone can introduce themselves now. I see we have some new people. Rob Chambers. We got Brian Biason. Are you?
Yeah, and Brian actually. Brian had a question. So Brian was asking if the implant was taken out. Brian, can you?
Yeah, I was on Mark's in the bathroom.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I guess that's a question for Mark, really.
Yeah, when Mark gets back, I was curious if he checked after to see if the implant was removed after she told the story. After he checked first, he saw it there. Then after, did he confirm that it was removed?
That would be interesting to find out. Kishle is from India. What time is it there?
It's basically 3:27 at midnight.
Okay,
Oh.
you're the youngest person here officially. Kishle's been emailing us because we also have this disclosure network where we're trying to bring about anti-gravity disclosure, trying to figure out how flying saucers operate out in the open, and that's pretty much the point of this conference. Is just to talk about the engineering side of flying saucers.
Yes.
And, he's very passionate about it as well, so we let him in here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jeremy, how's it going on YouTube?
It's going good, man. Vimanas. Sorry, I had a little. I was stepped away for a minute to clean up, but I broke a glass. But yeah, we're still live. I'm monitoring the chat. I've caught back up now. And,
There are 178 people in the chat. 178.
yeah, man.
Oh wow, that's like an
Impressive
all-time
numbers.
That's a very impressive number. Yeah,
Yeah.
there it goes.
You know, considering we don't use like chat bots and stuff like David Wilcox and some of those other people, you know, if we had like the paid audience and viewers and stuff, we'd probably get like 10K, you know, people watching live, or it would look like it anyway.
Well, guys, if I could jump in for a second, I would say, you know, I think Mark, he probably has to go to work in just a little while. You know what, we don't have the opportunity to talk to him every day. If you guys have any pressing questions or technical questions or anything like that, you know, I would definitely give some thought.
Yeah, I wanted to hear more about the Herkimer quartz because that's something that we're actually planning on doing here in the lab. I found a local glass making company. They're a pretty cool place. They actually have solar panels on their roof to power the whole lab. And it's a school of glass making. And we were thinking about making our own parallel plate capacitors. And then I found this company. I'm like, Jeremiah, I'm not buying any glass making company equipment. Let's just go to their place. It's a half-an-hour drive from the lab here. And we plan on doing that next month. We're going to have we're renting a house, basically a guest house. Jeremiah is coming down. Wayne is flying in from Canada. And Jeremy's going to be there sometime. We're going to be all together just working in the lab right here on these experiments. It's going to be exciting. Oh, there you are, Mark.
I'm back.
I wanted to ask you about the need for
Sorry, give me just a sec, Mark. Let me mute everyone, and then I will unmute you, gentlemen. And you know, Brian had a question. I think Brian just came back in. Brian was wondering if you had checked about the implant after, to see if the implant had been removed.
No, in fact, the thing that was really interesting was that about a year and a half or so after this investigation, the young lady reported that she had been abducted again, and that the problem was that in their attempts to remove this device from her ear, the military had damaged it. And so the aliens returned and not only replaced the implant in her first ear, but they put another one, a second implant in her other ear, which I had seen as a control in the very beginning. I'd looked at her healthy ear that hadn't been touched in any way. And here was this new, what appeared to be an even more advanced version of an implant that completely replaced the little tiny microscopic bones between the eardrum and the cochlea. It was basically a substitute that sat in between. And you're going to love this. The old implant on the other side had been replaced, and there were 3 spiral scars that were still bright red from a procedure where it appeared that the aliens had taken some kind of a tubular mandrel that had blades on it and they had basically screwed it into her ear canal as a guide for making a precision removal of the damaged implant that had been there previously. You could see what appeared to be an incision mark on the eardrum. I don't know how they separated the eardrum and then brought the two sides of the tissue back together, but apparently they had that ability. And here was a second updated, so to speak, version of the implant in the ear that had the original implant that looked like a fat horseshoe that straddled the tympanic bones. This one was the second style, the one that was a solid black shiny disc that completely replaced the tympanic bones between the eardrum and the cochlea. So I mean, that was the follow-up, and that was striking because I had seen both before and after what the case was, you know, so it certainly established in my mind that there seemed to be some kind of an ongoing competition between the military trying to obtain the technology with minimal impact to the victims, and the aliens who, for whatever reason, were attempting to track particular human beings. Now, subsequent to this, the young lady went to a medical clinic and had a number of x-rays done on her head. And what she discovered was that she is a kind of genetic anomaly, whereas you and I have sort of hollow sinus cavities above our eyes and in our cheekbones that are part of the respiratory system. She doesn't have any sinus cavities in her forehead. It's an additional area of brain case. She has actually a larger brain. So she apparently is some kind of a hybrid individual. She is genetically different than you and I. She has no sinuses in her forehead. She has additional brain case.
Okay, so I was going to ask about the Herkimer quartz in the parallel plate capacitors.
Okay.
You know, why it needs to be Herkimer quartz, not just regular quartz, or?
Well, you know, I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that when I was part of the disclosure project with Dr. Stephen Greer, from time to time, he would give me the contact information for people who had approached him that claimed that they or family members that they knew of had been involved in working on, repairing, or helping to build the original ARV. So in one instance, there was a young man who lived in the Seattle area, as I recall. He claimed that his mother had worked at Lockheed Skunk Works and that she had been in a hands-on position as far as working on and assembling and testing of the original ARV. And he was the individual who claimed that they were specifically using Herkimer quartz as the dielectric for their capacitor section.
Oh, okay, because we're actually here in northern New Jersey. We're able to go and get some Herkimer quartz and see if there's any difference between that and regular quartz. And from everything that I could search online and found out about Herkimer quartz, the only thing that's unique about it is that it forms in a place that does not have anything for it to attach to. Like quartz, when it forms in its molten form and when it's cooling, it normally gets attached to other rocks. So this is a type of quartz that doesn't have that ability because of the surrounding rocks. And that would be the only unique attribute about it. In which case, that would just make it a little harder to assemble because you'd have to get this quartz that's can only be mined in one place in the world, and it has some, magical function, sort of like an element 115 of quartz, make it hard.
Just to add, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
And me and Jeremiah were actually having a conversation about this. Is there anything special about?
Maybe I actually add something here, specifically about Herkimer quartz. One of our fellow researchers on the team, Sean, discovered, and we talked about this in quite a lengthy conversation that followed up Mark Sokol's and my conversation about Herkimer quartz and what's different about it. And what Sean had discovered is that Herkimer quartz is able to form in this area without any other material seemingly to connect with, because it contains carbon inclusions, long carbon inclusions. And this apparently changes the properties enough where the carbon inclusions can trigger or catalyze crystallization in the material. So we were also wanting to investigate the possibility of taking ordinary quartz, which is of course many times cheaper and more available, and basically adding our own carbon inclusions of various sorts.
In effect, doping it with
Right,
with
doping it with
material.
carbon to
Yeah.
simulate Herkimer quartz.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because the original witness had suggested to me that they were in fact doping the quartz in the capacitor section with heavy metals like uranium, and that by the statement that was made was that the higher the atomic number of the material they used to dope the quartz, the greater the mass reduction effect was per input of electrical power.
That makes sense to me because really, according to T. Townsend Brown's patent on the parallel plate capacitor experiment, the weight reduction was based off of the mass of the dielectric. So if you want the dielectric to be fucking heavy, you want it to be extremely heavy because that is where your pulse is coming from, that weight. So you want it to be as dense as possible. So you're going to throw in heavy elements that don't conduct electricity very well, probably like maybe bismuth or something like that. And maybe that's where the bismuth comes into the parallel plate capacitor.
To add to that, reading through Brown's notes, he talks a lot about using various lead oxides, which are rather heavy, and they are containing semiconductive properties. So Brown talks about in, I think, notebook number 2, about the semiconductive properties of the additives and how important these dopant materials actually are to the function of achieving the effect. And so we know Brown was quite the fan of using lead oxide and lead-2 oxide because that's a material that was available in his time. And in the correct concentrations as a dopant into the dielectrics, that lead oxide was the main contributor to the effect. So it wasn't necessarily heavy dielectrics as it was making sure that the dielectric contained a heavy element or something like that.
That's consistent with what the witness originally said to me. Yeah.
Okay, so let me bring Paul Murat on. He had a question, so I'm going to ask Paul to unmute now.
Mark, you mentioned that these women had mentioned the propulsion system. I don't know if you covered it that much details. Could you describe some more? And was one of the girls Andreessen?
No.
Okay.
But they don't live that far apart. Probably less than 50 miles apart. The Andreessen case took place in what was the name of this? Oh God, it was a particular canyon in Southern California, and it's right on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember the name of the canyon, but it's near Sylmar, California. And the other witness, the one that I had spoken about that had the implants in her ear, she lives in the community of Sierra Madre, which is right at the base of Mount Wilson in the Los Angeles area.
Well, what did they say that was so helpful to what's going on in terms of your knowledge about ARV?
Well, number one, there were several components in common. One was the central column that involved the use of something that appeared to be a mercury-like substance. In the case of the propulsion system she saw, it appeared to be liquefied mercury. But the flow patterns in the mercury suggested that, at least in that more advanced version of the propulsion system, that there might be counter-rotating cylinders and a movement of the mercury that facilitated the formation of these dynamic ionic smoke rings that would shoot down through the inside of the central column when the electrical discharge occurred. The second thing that I was about to say before the conversation sort of got diverted was that when she was standing at the railing of this pit, which was surrounding this central column, she said that she could look across to the far side of the pit and see the wall of the area beneath the floor that she was standing on, and that embedded, there was a clear glass-like substance that made up the entire height of that pit, and that embedded in that glass-like substance were what looked like copper coils that wrapped around what was probably the center section of this central column. And she said that she felt that the column extended below the floor, that the deck that she was on was somewhere in the center, from vertically oriented. If you talk about the vertical orientation or the location within the craft, that she was somewhere near the center section of the craft, and that she was seeing the upper portion of that central column.
So you're talking about the column, the plates on the bottom. Did she talk about the ring?
She talked about the coil. She never saw the plates in the bottom, but she did say that the type of craft that she was in was not a saucer, that it was more of a sphere-shaped craft.
Oh,
And
wow.
just by coincidence, when I had occasion to visit this individual from time to time, and there was an occasion when I went over to her house in the early evening. We went for a walk as we were talking, because she was concerned about being overheard by some of her neighbors, who by this time apparently had been approached by the military, and were looking for tidbits of information about the timing of these visits that she was receiving. Coincidentally, they were always on either the 11th or the 22nd of the month, whenever they happened. So I was talking with her when we went for this walk, and it was dark out, and we looked up, and way up in the sky, here is this little white sphere following us around, and you could see it moving around the sky. It was, in a very sort of irregular pattern of movement. You could tell that it wasn't a balloon, because it was sitting stationary against a slight wind, and it seemed to orient itself and change its orientation every time we moved. So we were certain that this thing it had an interest in my talking to her. And what was interesting was that I was spending a lot of time watching the sky, both from the location where I lived at the time, which was in Upland, California. It's just on the outskirts of San Bernardino, and also traveling up into the mountains near Big Bear, and watching the high desert from that location, during which time I saw a number of things that apparently were being flight tested that uses the same technology, would leave a green wavering ionization trail that ran horizontally for a certain number of miles and then would stop dead in its tracks. I've seen that many times over the years. What was I going to say?
You ever seen a triangular craft?
I have never seen one of those, but this young lady has on a number of occasions. Can we go back to you? What was your original question, Paul? I'm sorry.
I was curious about what they were talking about in terms of propulsion systems that was different from what you had already mentioned.
Oh, okay. The things that were in common. Well, they both had coils around the central column. They both had a column. They both had some kind of a small disc that rotated at the midpoint of the central column. In the case of the Alien Reproduction Vehicle, it was much larger in diameter, 9 feet approximately in diameter, in the 24-foot diameter craft, and that's measuring right at the base, at the widest part of the skirt at the bottom of the craft, 24 feet. But in the case of this object, this ring that was rotating at the base of this clear glass column inside the craft that this young lady was traveling in, she said that it only extended out maybe between 2 and 4 inches away from the outer diameter of that central column.